The morning of February 7th, 1945, Highway 5, north of San Jose, Luzon, Philippines. Sergeant James Richardson of Company C, 44th Tank Battalion, woke to a sound that did not belong. Through the pre-dawn darkness, somewhere beyond the roadblock his Sherman tank guarded, engines were running. Not American engines, not the familiar rumble of Detroit diesels that powered his 33-ton M4A3. These were different, higher-pitched, laboring. The unmistakable whine of Japanese tanks attempting to move quickly down a road they believed was open. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Richardson's crew scrambled to their positions. Around them, infantrymen from the 63rd Infantry Regiment were already taking cover behind hastily constructed barricades. Artillery crews were sighting their pieces down the highway. Everyone understood what was coming. The Japanese 2nd Tank Division, cornered after a week of brutal fighting at Muñoz, was attempting to break out. They were heading straight into an ambush they did not know existed. The Japanese tankers believed the road to San Jose was open. Their intelligence was 7 hours out of date. What they could not know, what their commanders had failed to communicate due to severed communication lines, was that American forces had taken San Jose 2 days earlier. What waited for them in the darkness was not an escape route. It was a killing ground. The first Japanese tank rounded the bend at 05:30 hours. A Type 97 Chiha medium tank, its 57mm gun traversing left and right as the commander searched for threats. Behind it, the column stretched back into the pre-dawn gloom. More Chihas. Type 95 Ha-Go light tanks, trucks carrying infantry and supplies. Artillery tractors, the remnants of an entire armoured garrison, attempting to flee before American forces could complete their encirclement. Sergeant Richardson watched through his periscope as the enemy column approached. His orders were explicit. Let them get close. Let them commit to the road, then destroy everything. The mathematics of what was about to happen were brutally simple. His M4A3 Sherman mounted a 75mm M3 gun, muzzle velocity of 2,000 feet per second, armor-piercing rounds that could penetrate 3 inches of steel plate at 1,000 yards. Against the Chiha's maximum armor thickness of 50mm, approximately 2 inches, the Sherman's gun was absolutely lethal at any practical engagement range. The Type 95 Ha-Go light tanks in the Japanese column were even more vulnerable. Maximum armor of just 12mm on the hull and turret, less than half an inch, armor so thin that heavy machine gun fire could penetrate it at close range. Against a 75mm tank gun, a Ha-Go had no chance of survival. A direct hit anywhere on the vehicle would catastrophically destroy it. But the Japanese tankers advancing toward the American positions did not know they were outmatched. They could not know. Because for 3 years, from December 1941 through late 1944, the Type 95 Ha-Go had been perfectly adequate for the wars Japan had fought. In Malaya, in Burma, in the Philippines during the initial invasion, against Chinese forces in Manchuria, the Ha-Go had performed its designed role effectively. Fast, reliable, capable of supporting infantry operations across difficult terrain where heavier tanks could not operate. The Ha-Go's story began in July 1933, when the Japanese army recognized a critical problem. Their existing Type 89 medium tank could not keep pace with motorized infantry. The Type 89, weighing 13 tons, had a maximum road speed of just 25 kilometers per hour. Too slow for the mobile warfare the Japanese army envisioned for future campaigns. Infantry could move at 40 kilometers per hour by truck. The tanks could not keep up. This created a fundamental tactical problem. Mechanized warfare required tanks that could advance at the same speed as the infantry they supported. The Army Technical Bureau issued requirements for a new light tank in 1933, maximum weight of 7 tons, top speed of 40 kilometers per hour to match truck-borne infantry, a 37mm main gun capable of engaging light armored vehicles and fortifications, 2 machine guns for anti-personnel work. The specifications prioritized mobility and speed over armor protection. This was not an oversight. This was a calculated decision based on Japanese military doctrine and the enemies Japan expected to face. Tomio Hara of the Army Technical Bureau led the design effort. Hara had studied tank design extensively, analyzing foreign models, observing exercises with experimental vehicles, examining the tactical requirements for armored warfare in the terrain where Japan would fight. His team at Mitsubishi completed a prototype in June 1934. The design incorporated Hara's distinctive bell crank suspension system, a simple but effective solution that would characterize Japanese tank designs for the next decade. The prototype exceeded expectations during testing: top speed of 43 km per hour, ability to cross 2-meter-wide trenches, operational range of 250 kilometers. The Imperial Japanese Army accepted the design in 1935 as the Type 95 light tank. The nickname Hago, meaning third model, came from Mitsubishi, the manufacturer. Production began in 1936 at Mitsubishi's facilities in Nagoya. The final production vehicle weighed 7.4 tons, crew of 3, commander gunner in the turret, hull machine gunner, and driver. The commander operated alone in the cramped turret space, responsible for commanding the tank, loading the main gun, aiming, firing, and operating the rear-facing machine gun. This workload would prove crushing in sustained combat, but in 1936 it was considered acceptable. The armor specifications reflected the design priorities: 6 to 12 mm throughout. The thickest armor, 12 mm, protected the front of the hull and turret. The thinnest, 6 mm, covered the top and bottom surfaces. This provided protection against rifle-caliber ammunition and shell fragments. It would not stop anti-tank weapons. It would not stop tank guns. But the designers believed speed and maneuverability would provide the tank's primary defense. The Hago would not engage in protracted gunnery duels with enemy tanks. It would support infantry, suppress resistance points, exploit breakthroughs. Speed would keep it out of danger. The main armament was a Type 94 37mm tank gun. Later production models used the improved Type 98 version with higher muzzle velocity. At 500 meters, the gun could penetrate 25 millimeters of vertical armor with armor-piercing rounds. This was adequate against light tanks and armored cars. It was inadequate against medium tanks with heavier armor. But in 1936, when production began, Japan's most likely opponents, Chinese forces, had virtually no armored vehicles. Soviet forces in Manchuria operated tanks, but Japanese planners believed superior training and tactics would compensate for any technical disadvantages. The power plant was a Mitsubishi A6120VD 6-cylinder air-cooled diesel engine, 120 horsepower. This gave the 7.4-ton tank a power-to-weight ratio of 16 horsepower per ton. Excellent by 1930s standards. The diesel engine provided good range and reliability. Fuel consumption was reasonable. The tank could operate for extended periods without refueling, critical for campaigns across the vast distances of China and Southeast Asia. By December 1941, when Japan launched its offensive across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, approximately 1,800 Type 95 tanks were in service. They would spearhead every major Japanese ground offensive for the next year: the invasion of Malaya, the capture of Singapore, the conquest of the Philippines, the advance into Burma. In these campaigns, the Hago proved devastatingly effective. The Malayan campaign demonstrated the Hago's capabilities perfectly. In December 1941, Japanese forces invaded Malaya with approximately 160 tanks, mostly Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tanks and Type 95 Hago light tanks. British commanders had assured their forces that tanks could not operate in Malayan jungle terrain. The roads were inadequate. The ground was too soft. Armoured operations were impossible. The Japanese proved them catastrophically wrong. The Type 95's relatively light weight and good power-to-weight ratio allowed it to traverse terrain British commanders had deemed impassable for armour. Japanese tanks advanced down roads British forces had not defended because they believed those roads could not support armoured vehicles. Tank-supported attacks smashed through defensive positions. The psychological impact was immense. British and Indian troops who had been told tanks could not reach them suddenly faced armor advancing through jungle they had considered impenetrable. Singapore fell on February 15, 1942. Japanese armor had played a critical role in the campaign, despite British assumptions that armored warfare in Malaya was impossible. The Type 95 had demonstrated that speed, mobility, and aggressive employment could overcome defensive positions even when facing numerically superior forces. In the Philippines, the story was similar. Japanese forces landed on Luzon on December 22, 1941. The 4th Tank Regiment, equipped with Type 95 tanks, engaged American M3 Stuart light tanks near De Mortis on December 22. This was the first tank versus tank engagement between American and Japanese forces in World War II. The M3 Stuart and Type 95 were closely matched. Both mounted 37mm main guns. Both were light tanks designed for reconnaissance and infantry support rather than tank versus tank combat. The Stuart had better armor, 38mm maximum compared to 12mm on the Hargo, but the engagement was inconclusive. One Stuart was destroyed. The remaining American tanks withdrew. Japanese forces continued their advance. For the next 3 months, as American and Filipino forces retreated to Bataan, the Type 95 supported Japanese infantry operations effectively. The tank's lightweight allowed it to cross bridges that heavier vehicles could not use. Its diesel engine provided good range for operations across Luzon's road network. By April 1942, when the last American forces on Bataan surrendered, Japanese armor had demonstrated its value in Pacific warfare. These early successes created a dangerous illusion. Japanese tankers believed their vehicles were adequate for the wars they would fight. The Hargo had defeated British forces in Malaya. It had helped drive American forces from the Philippines. It had operated successfully in Burma. The tank appeared to meet all requirements. There seemed no urgent need for improved designs. But the conditions that had made the Hargo effective were not going to last. In Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines in early 1942, Japanese forces had faced limited opposition from enemy tanks. British forces in Malaya had few armoured vehicles. American forces in the Philippines had been surprised, outnumbered, and cut off from supplies. The Hargo had not needed to fight sustained battles against well-equipped, well-supplied enemy armour operating with air support and artillery. That was about to change dramatically. And when it did, every design choice that had made the Hargo successful in 1942 would become a death sentence for its crews. The first warning came at Guadalcanal. On August 7, 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. This was the first major American offensive in the Pacific. It marked the transition from Japanese expansion to Allied counteroffensive. Japanese forces responded by attempting to recapture the island. This would require armoured support. The terrain on Guadalcanal was challenging. Jungle, rivers, limited road network. Exactly the conditions where the Type 95's lightweight and good mobility should have provided advantages. But the tactical situation was fundamentally different from Malaya or the Philippines. American forces were not retreating. They were defending prepared positions. They had artillery support, they had air support, and increasingly, they had tanks. On October 23, 1942, Japanese forces attempted a coordinated attack to recapture Henderson Airfield. The assault included infantry supported by Type 97 medium tanks. American Marine Corps defenders had M3 Stuart light tanks and well-prepared defensive positions. The engagement was one-sided. Japanese tanks advancing across open ground toward prepared American positions were systematically destroyed. Marine tankers reported that hits anywhere on Japanese tanks produced catastrophic results. This pattern would repeat throughout the Guadalcanal campaign and subsequent island battles. Japanese tanks designed to support infantry against opponents with limited anti-tank capability were now facing American forces with effective anti-tank weapons, tank, support, and complete tactical awareness of Japanese approaches. The Hargo's thin armour, which had been adequate against rifle fire and shell fragments, provided no protection against dedicated anti-tank weapons. American forces developed anti-tank tactics specifically for Pacific conditions. Bazookas proved extremely effective against Japanese light tanks. The 2.36-inch rocket could penetrate 12 millimeters of armor easily. A Hago hit anywhere by a bazooka round was likely to be destroyed or disabled. 37mm anti-tank guns, which had struggled against German armor in North Africa, were perfectly adequate against Japanese tanks with 12mm maximum armor. Even more devastating were tank versus tank engagements. When the M3 Stuart, with its 38mm of frontal armor, faced a Type 95 with 12mm of armor, the advantage was entirely with the American tank. Both vehicles mounted 37mm guns, but the Stuart's armor could resist the Hago's gun at combat ranges. The Hago's armor could not resist the Stuart's gun at any range. By late 1943, American forces were fielding the M4 Sherman medium tank in Pacific operations. This fundamentally changed the tactical picture. The Sherman weighed 33 tons. It mounted a 75mm gun with armor-piercing rounds that could penetrate 3 inches of steel at 1,000 yards. Its frontal armor, 50 to 76mm depending on the variant, was effectively immune to the Type 95's 37mm gun at normal combat ranges. The first major engagement between Shermans and Japanese armor occurred at Tarawa in November 1943. 3 M4 Shermans made it ashore on the first day of the invasion. Japanese defenders had Type 95 light tanks dug in as pillboxes. The Shermans systematically destroyed them. Marine tankers reported that a single 75mm high-explosive round was usually sufficient to destroy a Hago. Armor-piercing rounds often passed completely through the thin armor without detonating. This was the reality that Japanese tankers would face for the remainder of the war. Their tanks, designed in the early 1930s for a different kind of warfare, were now hopelessly outclassed. But production could not be stopped. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to design, develop, and mass-produce improved tanks while simultaneously maintaining production of existing models. The decision was made to continue building Type 95 tanks rather than retooling for new designs. By war's end, approximately 2,300 Type 95 tanks were produced. Most were built between 1936 and 1943, though limited production continued into 1944. These tanks were distributed across the Pacific theater. Some defended island garrisons. Some supported infantry operations in China and Burma, and in January 1945, approximately 200 tanks, including Type 95s and Type 97 medium tanks, were concentrated in the Japanese 2nd Tank Division on Luzon. This was the largest concentration of Japanese armor American forces had faced in the Pacific War. General Douglas MacArthur's forces, landing at Lingayen Gulf on January 9, 1945, faced a genuine armored threat. The Japanese 2nd Tank Division, under command of Lieutenant General Yoshiharu Iwanaka, had orders to contest the American advance toward Manila. For the first time in the Pacific, Japanese armor would attempt a coordinated defensive campaign rather than isolated last-stand actions. American intelligence knew the 2nd Tank Division existed. Aerial reconnaissance had identified tank assembly areas. Filipino guerrilla networks reported tank movements, but the exact location and intentions of the Japanese armor remained unclear through the first weeks of the campaign. Major General Innis Swift, commanding 1st Corps, worried constantly about an armored counterattack against his exposed flanks. The nightmare scenario, Japanese tanks breaking through and disrupting supply lines, haunted planning sessions. The tanks never came. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding Japanese forces in the Philippines, had no intention of throwing his armor away in futile counterattacks. Instead, he ordered the 2nd Tank Division to defensive positions around San Jose, blocking approaches to the Balete Pass and protecting supply routes for infantry units moving to mountain defensive positions. The tanks would fight from prepared positions, their main guns used as anti-tank artillery, their crews fighting dismounted if necessary. By late January, American forces were closing in on the San Jose area. The 6th Infantry Division, with attached tank support from Company C, 44th Tank Battalion, advanced toward the Japanese positions. On January 31st, the division encountered dug-in Japanese tanks at Muñoz, a small town southwest of San Jose. Intelligence had reported a company of Japanese infantry occupied the town. The actual garrison included at least 57 tanks, plus anti-tank guns, and engineer units fighting as infantry. The battle for Muñoz began on February 1st. American infantry assaulted from the southwest, supported by field artillery and 4.2-inch mortars. The Japanese defenders fought from prepared positions. Tanks were dug in with only their turrets exposed, surrounded by sandbags and logs 3 feet thick. Multiple alternate positions allowed damaged tanks to withdraw and reposition. Anti-tank guns covered approaches. The terrain, boggy ground with deep, water-filled irrigation ditches, restricted American tank movement. Company C, 44th Tank Battalion, surveyed their objective with growing apprehension. The battalion history described the tactical challenge. Tank operations were severely limited by terrain, boggy ground, deep irrigation ditches. Japanese positions were dug in with exceptional engineering. Overhead cover protected against artillery. Alternate positions made targeting difficult. This would not be a maneuver battle. This would be a grinding fight to systematically reduce fortified positions. The Americans attacked with combined arms. M7 self-propelled howitzers with 105mm guns provided direct fire support, their high-explosive rounds destroying emplacements that tank guns could not penetrate. Shermans advanced to close range, trading shots with dug-in Japanese tanks. Infantry with bazookas worked through the town, targeting tanks from short range where the rockets were most effective. It was savage, close-quarters fighting. Japanese defenders knew their tanks were outgunned. Their only chance was to engage American armor at the Cromp, closest possible range, where accuracy mattered more than penetration capability. The battle lasted a week. By February 7th, the town of Muñoz was finally secure, but at significant cost. American forces had destroyed 57 Japanese tanks. The 63rd Infantry Regiment and elements of the 20th Infantry Regiment had suffered heavy casualties, clearing the town street by street. 3 American tanks were destroyed, multiple others were damaged. But Muñoz was not the end. It was one position in a larger defensive network. Japanese forces still held Lupao to the north, and at San Jose, American forces were about to spring the trap that would destroy the last organized Japanese armored formation in the Philippines. General Yamashita, recognizing that the defensive positions around San Jose could not hold indefinitely, ordered the 2nd Tank Division to withdraw on February 4th. Pull back to defensive positions further north. Preserve the force. The order was transmitted to division headquarters, but due to damaged communication systems, it did not reach all units for 2 days. On the night of February 6th into February 7th, the remnants of the Japanese garrison at Muñoz began their withdrawal. They believed the road to San Jose was open. They believed they could reach friendly lines, regroup, and continue the fight. They were moving as quickly as darkness and their damaged vehicles allowed, desperate to escape before American forces completed their encirclement. They did not know that San Jose had fallen to the 6th Infantry Division on February 5th. They did not know that the highway they were traveling was now a carefully prepared killing zone. And they especially did not know that Company C, 44th Tank Battalion, supported by elements of the 63rd Infantry Regiment, was waiting in ambush positions, with clear fields of fire down the highway they were traveling. Sergeant Richardson's finger rested on the trigger of his 75mm gun. The Japanese column was 300 yards away now, close enough that he could see individual details through his periscope. The lead Chiha tank commander standing in his turret, scanning for threats. Infantry riding on the backs of trucks, artillery tractors straining under their loads. Everyone moving with the desperate urgency of soldiers who believe they're escaping encirclement. The American artillery fired first, 105mm howitzers positioned on high ground to the east. The shells came down along the length of the Japanese column with devastating precision. Orange fireballs erupted in the pre-dawn darkness. A truck carrying infantry disintegrated, throwing bodies and debris across the road. An artillery tractor took a direct hit, its ammunition cooking off in a series of secondary explosions that lit the landscape like daylight. The Japanese column halted. Commanders tried to assess the situation. Was this harassing fire from a distant American unit? A blocking position they could fight through? Where was the threat coming from? They had seconds to make decisions. They made the wrong ones. The lead Chi-Ha tank accelerated, attempting to push through what its commander assumed was a hastily established roadblock. Behind it, other tanks began deploying off the road, seeking fighting positions. Infantry dismounted from trucks, taking cover in ditches. The column was transforming from a movement formation into a combat formation, but they were doing it blind, with no idea where the enemy positions actually were. Richardson fired. His gunner had centered the reticle on the lead Chi-Ha's hull. The 75mm armor-piercing round left the barrel at 2,030 feet per second. At 300 yards, the flight time was negligible. The round struck the Chi-Ha's frontal armor, 50mm thick, sloped at 20 degrees, and punched through as if the steel plate was tissue paper. The penetrating round ripped through the Chi-Ha's fighting compartment. It struck ammunition. The tank's turret lifted off its ring in a massive explosion, flipping completely over and landing upside down 20 feet from the burning hull. The crew never had time to react. One moment they were alive, moving forward, believing they might escape. The next moment they ceased to exist. The ambush erupted along the entire length of the highway. 7 M4 Shermans from Company C opened fire simultaneously. Machine guns from the 63rd Infantry Regiment raked the column. Mortar rounds began falling among the trucks and personnel carriers. In the opening 30 seconds, 6 Japanese tanks were destroyed or disabled. Dozens of infantry were killed or wounded. The column, caught in the open with nowhere to maneuver, was being systematically annihilated. A Type 95 Hago attempted to return fire. Its commander, showing remarkable courage or desperation, traversed his 37mm gun toward the American positions. He fired. The armor-piercing round struck the frontal glacis of Richardson's Sherman at an oblique angle. The round bounced off harmlessly, deflected by armor 3 times thicker than what the Hago's gun had been designed to penetrate. The ricochet created a bright spark visible in the darkness, but caused no damage whatsoever to the American tank. Richardson's gunner traversed onto the Hago. At this range, 250 yards, the engagement was not a duel. It was an execution. The 75mm gun fired. The Hago's 12mm armor provided absolutely no resistance. The armor-piercing round penetrated the hull, passed through the fighting compartment, exited through the rear armor, and continued traveling for another 100 yards before striking the ground. But the round did not pass through cleanly. Inside the Hago, the penetrating projectile struck the main gun ammunition. 70 rounds of 37mm ammunition, each with its explosive propellant charge, began detonating. The tank's thin armor could not contain the pressure. The hull split open along welded seams. Flames erupted from every opening, hatch, vision, port, and fracture. The 3-man crew died instantly, incinerated by the temperature and pressure inside the exploding tank. Across the killing zone, the pattern repeated. Japanese tanks attempting to fight were destroyed in seconds. The Type 95 light tanks with their 12mm armor and 37mm guns had absolutely no capability to harm the M4 Shermans they faced. They could not penetrate Sherman armor at any practical range. Their own armor could not resist Sherman guns at any range. The only question was how long each Japanese tank survived before being hit. Some Japanese tankers recognized the futility immediately. Crews abandoned their vehicles, attempting to flee on foot into the surrounding fields. American machine gun fire cut them down. Others fought to the end, firing round after round at American positions, watching their shells bounce harmlessly off Sherman armor, dying when return fire finally found them. A few tanks, recognizing they could not win a gunnery duel, attempted to charge the American positions, hoping to close the range where their lighter guns might find weak points in Sherman armor. A Type 97 Chi-Ha accelerated directly toward Richardson's position. Its commander had made the tactical calculation. At 50 yards, his 57mm gun might penetrate a Sherman's side armor. It was a desperate gamble, but the only one available. The Chiha's driver pushed the tank to maximum speed, 38 km per hour, weaving to make targeting more difficult. 37mm rounds from its hull machine gun position sprayed toward the American lines. Richardson's gunner tracked the approaching tank calmly. At 150 yards, he fired. The armor-piercing round struck the Chiha's glacis plate. At this oblique angle and short range, even the Chiha's relatively thick frontal armor could not stop a 75mm anti-tank round. The shell penetrated into the crew compartment and detonated. The Chiha did not explode dramatically. It simply stopped. The engine kept running for a few seconds, then sputtered and died. Smoke began rising from the hatches. No crew members emerged. The tank sat motionless in the middle of the highway, another burning monument to the futility of Japanese armor against American firepower. The entire engagement lasted 40 minutes. By 06:15 hours, when the sky was growing light enough to assess damage without artificial illumination, the Japanese column had ceased to exist as an organized force. 10 tanks lay destroyed along the highway. A Type 95 Hago, completely burned out, its turret separated from the hull. 2 Type 97 Chiha medium tanks, one with its entire front section blown apart by ammunition explosions. 7 more tanks of various types, all burning, all obviously beyond recovery, multiple trucks destroyed. 2 artillery tractors disabled, an all-terrain vehicle overturned in a ditch. Equipment abandoned everywhere as survivors fled into the surrounding countryside. 245 Japanese soldiers were dead, some killed in the initial artillery barrage, some cut down by machine gun fire as they dismounted from vehicles, some trapped inside burning tanks. The survivors, perhaps 50 to 75 men, had scattered into the agricultural land surrounding the highway. They would be hunted down over the following days by American infantry and Filipino guerrillas. Few would survive to reach Japanese lines. American losses for the engagement were minimal. Company C reported 1 soldier killed, 11 wounded, 2 tanks damaged but repairable. The asymmetry was staggering. In 40 minutes of combat, American forces had destroyed approximately 1/10 of the remaining Japanese armored strength on Luzon, while suffering casualties that would not significantly impair combat effectiveness. The battalion newspaper of the 6th Army called it the hottest tank-on-tank battle in the Pacific. This designation was simultaneously accurate and misleading. Accurate because it involved more Japanese tanks than most Pacific engagements. Misleading because calling it a battle implied the Japanese had some chance of success. This had not been a battle. This had been a massacre. The Japanese tanks had been destroyed by an enemy they could not effectively harm, caught in an ambush they did not anticipate, fighting a losing battle from the moment they entered the kill zone. But the February 7th ambush was just one engagement in a broader pattern of destruction. The entire Japanese 2nd Tank Division was being systematically annihilated across multiple locations in the San Jose area. At Lupao, American forces destroyed 40 tanks dug in as part of the town's defenses. At San Manuel, 45 more Japanese tanks were reduced to burning hulks over a week of fighting. Smaller engagements accounted for dozens of additional losses. By March 5, 1945, the Japanese 2nd Tank Division had lost 203 Type 97 Chiha tanks and 19 Type 95 Hago tanks. Of the approximately 220 tanks the division had brought to Luzon, fewer than 20 remained operational. The division had been destroyed as an effective fighting force. The survivors were scattered, their tanks either destroyed, abandoned for lack of fuel and spare parts, or dug in as static pillboxes for infantry to defend. The destruction was so complete that it requires explanation. How did an entire armored division, Japan's only tank division in the Philippines, the largest concentration of Japanese armor in the Pacific theater, get annihilated in just over the month of combat? The answer lies in the fundamental mismatch between the tanks Japan had built and the war Japan was now fighting. The Type 95 Hago had been designed in 1933 for a specific tactical situation: mobile warfare supporting infantry against opponents with limited anti-tank capability. Light armor was acceptable because speed would provide protection. A modest gun was acceptable because the tank would primarily fight unarmored or lightly armored targets. Limited crew comfort was acceptable because engagements would be short. Every design choice made perfect sense for the wars Japan fought between 1937 and 1942. But by 1945, everything had changed. American forces were not Chinese infantry with limited heavy weapons. They were not surprised British defenders in Malaya caught without adequate anti-tank defences. American infantry divisions in 1945 had organic anti-tank companies with 57mm guns that could destroy any Japanese tank at normal combat ranges. They had bazooka teams that could disable Japanese light tanks with single rocket hits. They had artillery support that could call down massed fires on Japanese positions. And critically, they had tank support. The M4 Sherman medium tank outclassed every Japanese armoured vehicle in every category that mattered. Armour protection. The Sherman's 50 to 76mm of frontal armour was immune to Japanese tank guns at normal combat ranges. The Type 95's 37mm gun could not penetrate Sherman armour except at point-blank range against side or rear plates. Even the Type 97's 57mm gun struggled to penetrate Sherman frontal armour at ranges where the Sherman could engage effectively. Firepower. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun could penetrate Japanese tank armour at any practical combat range. Against the Hargo's 12mm of armour, Sherman gunners reported that high-explosive rounds were often more effective than armour-piercing rounds. The armour-piercing rounds would pass completely through the thin armour without detonating. High-explosive rounds would detonate on contact, the blast effect being sufficient to rupture the thin armour plates and kill or incapacitate the crew. Mobility. The Sherman weighed 33 tons, but had a 400 horsepower engine, giving it a power-to-weight ratio of 12 horsepower per ton. The Type 95 weighed 7.4 tons with a 120 horsepower engine, 16 horsepower per ton. On paper, the Hargo had better power-to-weight ratio. In practice, the Sherman's superior ground clearance, better suspension, and more reliable drivetrain gave it equal or better tactical mobility across most terrain. And the Sherman's greater weight meant it could push through obstacles that would stop lighter vehicles. Crew survivability. Sherman. Crews had a reasonable chance of surviving hits that penetrated the armour. The spacious interior, escape hatches positioned for quick egress, and stored ammunition protected in armoured bins below the turret ring all improved crew survival rates. Hargo crews had no such advantages. The cramped interior meant penetrating hits would almost certainly kill or wound crew members. Ammunition stored throughout the fighting compartment meant any penetration risked catastrophic explosion. Crew positions provided minimal protection. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The American advantages extended beyond individual tank capabilities to operational factors. Logistics. American forces had supply lines that could deliver fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and replacement vehicles to forward units with remarkable efficiency. Japanese forces on Luzon were cut off from meaningful resupply. Tanks that broke down could not be repaired for lack of spare parts. Tanks that consumed their fuel allocations could not be refueled. Tanks that expended their ammunition could not rearm. Air superiority. American forces operated under complete air superiority. Japanese tanks moving during daylight risked attack from American aircraft. P-38 fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts, and other ground attack aircraft could strike Japanese armoured columns with bombs, rockets, and machine gun fire. Japanese forces learned to move only at night, but this severely limited their operational flexibility. Intelligence. American forces had excellent intelligence on Japanese positions from aerial reconnaissance and Filipino guerrilla networks. Japanese commanders operated largely blind, unable to conduct effective reconnaissance due to American air superiority and aggressive patrolling. The February 7th ambush succeeded partially because Japanese forces had no idea American troops occupied San Jose. Their intelligence was hours out of date, and there was no way to update it. Training. American tank crews by 1945 were well-trained, experienced, and confident in their equipment. Many had combat experience from earlier Pacific operations. They understood their tanks' capabilities and limitations. They knew how to employ combined arms tactics. Japanese tank crews varied widely in quality. Some were veterans of early Pacific campaigns. Others were recent conscripts with minimal training. All knew their tanks were outclassed, and this knowledge affected morale and combat effectiveness. But perhaps the most telling factor was doctrine. American armored doctrine emphasized combined arms operations. Tanks worked with infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support to accomplish missions. If tanks encountered resistance they could not overcome, they would call for artillery support or airstrikes. They would bypass strong points and let follow on. Infantry reduce them. They understood that tank survival mattered because trained crews and functioning vehicles were valuable assets that took time to replace. Japanese doctrine, particularly by 1945, treated tanks as expendable. Crews were expected to fight to the death. Tanks that could no longer move would be dug in as pillboxes. Damaged tanks would be cannibalized for parts to keep other vehicles running. Retreat was often forbidden even when tactically sensible. This resulted in tanks being committed to hopeless situations where they were destroyed without accomplishing meaningful objectives. The destruction of the 2nd Tank Division exemplified all these factors. Japanese tanks were inferior to American tanks in every measurable category. Japanese logistics could not sustain armored operations. Japanese commanders lacked the intelligence to employ their armor effectively. Japanese doctrine committed tanks to static defensive positions where their mobility advantages were negated, and they could be systematically reduced by American firepower. After March 1945, Japanese armored operations on Luzon effectively ceased. The few surviving tanks were hidden, dug in, or abandoned. American forces would occasionally encounter individual Japanese tanks operating as pillboxes, but organized tank operations were over. The 2nd Tank Division, which had represented Japan's last significant armored force in the Philippines, had been destroyed. The lessons were being learned across the Pacific. At Iwo Jima in February and March 1945, Japanese forces had no tanks. The volcanic terrain made armored operations impractical. At Okinawa in April through June 1945, Japanese forces had fewer than 30 tanks, all committed to static defensive positions. None conducted mobile operations. Japanese commanders recognized that tank versus tank engagements against American armor were suicide. Better to save the few remaining tanks for homeland defense. For the crews of the Type 95 Hago, the war had become a death sentence. Every engagement against American armor was asymmetric. Japanese tankers could not harm American tanks at ranges where American tanks could destroy them. The only way to engage effectively was to close to point-blank range, exposing themselves to devastating fire in the process. Most crews died attempting this. The few who succeeded would disable or destroy one American tank before being overwhelmed by others. Former Type 95 crewmen who survived the war described the experience in similar terms. The tank was reliable. It was mechanically sound. It could traverse difficult terrain. But against American armor, it was useless. Its gun could not penetrate. Its armor could not protect. Its speed could not save it. Crews knew they were driving into combat in vehicles that could not accomplish their mission and could not protect them when they tried. One veteran, interviewed decades after the war, described the experience simply, "We were sent to die. We knew it. Our commanders knew it. But we went anyway, because that was our duty." The Type 95 was not a bad tank when it was designed. It was a good tank for the wrong war. By 1945, we were fighting a war our tanks could not win. The production statistics tell the story of waste and futility. Approximately 2,300 Type 95 tanks were built between 1936 and 1943. Of these, the vast majority were destroyed in combat, most after they had become obsolete. The tanks built after 1942 were obsolete the moment they left the factory. Japanese industry continued building them because there was no alternative. Retooling for improved designs would have stopped production entirely for months or years. Better to build obsolete tanks than no tanks at all. But this created a tragic situation. tank crews were being sent into combat in vehicles everyone knew were inadequate. Factory workers were building tanks everyone knew would not survive contact with the enemy. Resources that might have been used for other purposes, aircraft, ships, anti-tank guns, were being consumed to build tanks that could not accomplish their mission. The Type 95's combat career ended not with a dramatic last stand, but with gradual, ignominious destruction. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces abandoned Hago tanks when fuel ran out. They destroyed them when retreating to prevent capture. They dug them in as pillboxes when mobile operations became impossible. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, perhaps 200 Type 95 tanks remained in various states of repair across the former Japanese Empire. The final combat action for Type 95 tanks came in August 1945 during the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. The 11th Tank Regiment, stationed in the Kuril Islands, had 25 Type 95 tanks and 39 Type 97 medium tanks. On August 18th, Soviet forces conducted an amphibious landing on Shumshu Island. The Japanese tanks counterattacked. The engagement lasted 2 hours. The Soviet forces, veteran tankers fresh from defeating Germany, were equipped with T-34 medium tanks and heavy assault guns. The technical mismatch was even worse than against American Shermans. The T-34's 76mm gun and sloped armor made it invulnerable to Japanese tank fire at normal combat ranges. Soviet guns destroyed Japanese tanks with methodical efficiency. By the time the fighting ended, 21 Japanese tanks had been destroyed. The survivors withdrew. 3 days later, the garrison surrendered. It was the last tank action of World War II, a final demonstration of how completely Japanese armor had been surpassed by its opponents. The Americans who examined captured Type 95 tanks after the war were struck by the contrast between build quality and combat capability. The tanks were well made. Components showed good workmanship. The diesel engine was reliable and efficient. The suspension worked effectively. These were competently engineered vehicles built by skilled workers, but they were engineered to specifications from 1933. By 1945, those specifications were a death sentence. One American technical intelligence report noted the fundamental problem. The Type 95 light tank represents sound engineering practice for its era of design. For operations against opponents with limited anti-tank capability, it would be adequate. However, when employed against forces equipped with modern anti-tank weapons and armor, it is hopelessly outclassed. Armor protection is insufficient against any contemporary anti-tank weapon. Main armament is inadequate against contemporary armored vehicles. The design represents tactical thinking from an earlier period of warfare. The report writers were being diplomatic. What they meant was simpler. The Type 95 was obsolete. Its crews were being sent to fight in tanks that could not protect them and could not harm the enemy. This was not a problem that training could solve or tactics could overcome. This was a fundamental design inadequacy that made the tank unsuitable for the war Japan was fighting by 1945. The broader lesson was about industrial capacity and technological development. Japan had entered the war with adequate tanks for the conflicts of the 1930s and early 1940s, but Japan lacked the industrial capacity to develop and produce improved designs quickly enough to match Allied technological advancement. American tank production went from the M3 Stuart to the M4 Sherman to improved Sherman variants with better guns and armor, all while maintaining massive production numbers. Japanese tank production remained largely static. The Type 95, designed in 1933, was still being built in 1943. Improved designs like the Type 3 Chinu medium tank were developed, but production numbers remained tiny. By war's end, only 166 Chinu tanks had been built, and none saw combat. They were held back for the defense of the Japanese home islands, an invasion that never came. This pattern, continued production of obsolete equipment because retooling was impossible, characterized Japanese industry across multiple sectors. Aircraft, ships, weapons, all showed the same trend. Initial designs adequate for early war conditions, but increasingly inadequate, as Allied technology advanced, and an industrial base unable to develop and produce improvements quickly enough to maintain parity. For the tankers of the Type 95, this meant they fought the entire war in vehicles that became progressively more dangerous to crew. Early war engagements in Malaya and the Philippines had been survivable. The tank could accomplish its mission with reasonable crew survivability. By late 1944 and 1945, every combat action was near suicidal. The tank could not accomplish its mission, and crew survival rates approached zero in any engagement with American armor. The survivors of Company C, 44th Tank Battalion, who fought in the February 7th ambush, returned to that question repeatedly in later years. How did the Japanese keep fighting in tanks they knew were inadequate? Why did crews continue manning vehicles that offered no protection and no chance of success? The answers they received from Japanese veterans were consistent: duty, obedience, cultural values that prioritized collective obligation over individual survival, and perhaps most telling, a recognition that refusing to fight accomplished nothing. The war would continue, someone else would crew the tank. At least by fighting, they might buy time for others to escape or accomplish some small tactical objective. This represented a fundamental philosophical difference in how Japan and America approached warfare. American doctrine valued equipment and training. Experienced crews and functional tanks were resources to be preserved when possible. Missions that could not be accomplished with acceptable losses were declined or postponed until conditions improved. Japanese doctrine, particularly by late war, treated individual soldiers and equipment as expendable. Missions were to be accomplished regardless of cost. Survival was secondary to objective completion. Neither approach was inherently superior in all circumstances. American caution sometimes missed opportunities. Japanese determination sometimes achieved objectives that conventional military analysis suggested were impossible. But in a long war of industrial attrition, the American approach was sustainable. Crews and equipment preserved today could fight tomorrow. The Japanese approach was not sustainable. Crews and equipment expended today were gone forever, and Japan's industrial base could not replace them quickly enough. The Type 95 Hago story ends with the statistics of destruction. Of approximately 2,300 built, perhaps 200 survived the war in any condition. The rest were destroyed in combat, abandoned and demolished during retreats, or scrapped when fuel and spare parts ran out. Most crews did not survive. Casualty rates for Japanese tank crews in the Pacific War approached 80% by some estimates, higher than infantry, higher than most other combat arms. A consequence of fighting in inadequate vehicles against superior opponents, the handful of surviving Type 95 tanks ended up scattered across the Pacific and Asia. Some were captured by American forces and shipped to the United States for technical evaluation. These vehicles eventually ended up in museums or military collections. Some were captured by Chinese Communist forces during the Chinese Civil War and used until better equipment became available. Some remained in Southeast Asia, used by various forces during post-war conflicts, until finally abandoned as completely obsolete. Today, perhaps 15 Type 95 tanks survive in museums worldwide. They represent a chapter of armored warfare history that is often overshadowed by the more famous tank battles in Europe. But the Pacific Tank War, particularly the destruction of Japanese armor in the Philippines in early 1945, demonstrates lessons that remain relevant. Technological parity matters. Industrial capacity determines what can be produced and how quickly obsolete equipment can be replaced. Doctrine and training affect how equipment is employed. And ultimately, sending soldiers into combat with inadequate equipment is sending them to die. The morning of February 7th, 1945, on Highway 5 north of San Jose, was not the largest tank battle of World War II. It was not the most strategically significant, but for the Japanese crews who died in obsolete tanks, unable to harm the enemy that destroyed them, it represented the culmination of a series of decisions made years earlier in Tokyo design bureaus and army planning offices. Decisions to prioritize speed over armor, decisions to continue producing obsolete designs rather than retooling for improvements, decisions to commit inadequate forces to impossible missions. Sergeant Richardson, whose Sherman tank had destroyed 3 Japanese vehicles that morning, would later say he felt no satisfaction in the engagement. It was not combat, it was execution. The Japanese tankers had fought bravely, but they never had a chance. Our 75mm gun could punch through their armor like it was cardboard. Their guns could not hurt us at any range. They kept fighting anyway. That takes courage. But courage is not enough when the equipment fails you. The February 7th ambush destroyed 10 Japanese tanks in 40 minutes. The broader battles around San Jose, Muñoz, and Lupao destroyed over 100 more in the first week of February. By March, the Japanese 2nd Tank Division had effectively ceased to exist. 223 tanks destroyed or abandoned. Thousands of trained crew members dead. Japan's last significant armored force in the Philippines eliminated. The Type 95 Hago had been a good tank for the wars of the 1930s. Fast, reliable, adequate for its designed mission. But war had moved beyond it. By 1945, it was a relic, a machine from an earlier era being asked to fight battles it was never designed to win. And the men who crewed it paid the price for decisions they had no part in making, fighting in tanks that could not protect them against enemies they could not harm. That is the true story of the Type 95, not a tale of Japanese incompetence or American invincibility. A demonstration of what happens when technological development, industrial capacity, and military doctrine diverge too far from the reality of the battlefield. The tank was obsolete. Everyone knew it, but production continued, crews kept manning them, and they kept dying in vehicles that could no longer accomplish their mission. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.